Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this week's Snack and Chat, Adopt for Life's weekly Facebook Live, where we explore topics that are top of mind for families formed by adoption, kinship, and customary care. Today, my guest is Hadassah Rais, and we're going to be talking about the topic of trauma and eating disorders. For those of you that are new here, my name is Chantal. I'm the Community Engagement Liaison with Adopt for Life. I'm going to just quickly introduce our guest, Hadassah, who has been practicing as an occupational therapist and psychotherapist for 20 years. She is duly registered with the College of Occupational Therapists of Ontario and the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario. Her clinical practice primarily focuses on providing hope and support to individuals with severe and enduring eating disorders who have experienced complex or developmental trauma. Hadassah is also passionate about providing psychotherapy to individuals who have experienced grief and trauma related to infertility, pregnancy loss, or perinatal death. Outside of her work, Hadassah cherishes spending time being the permanent parent to 4 beautiful, amazing humans who have come into her life through the foster care system. So thank you, Hadassah, for joining us today. And thank you out there for watching. Maybe you're watching right now live. Maybe you're watching this later on replay. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. Feel free to ask questions or add your comment in the chat. I'll just take this opportunity to remind you that this is being live streamed on our public Facebook page. So what you are putting in the comments or when you're asking your question, it is publicly available. So just be mindful that you're not going to include any identifiable information, so names or specific health information when discussing your children. But with that in mind, we'd love to hear from you. So please feel free to ask your questions or put in your comments, and we hope that you find this discussion informative and engaging. So welcome, Hadassah. Thank you again for being here. Happy March 1st.
Thank you so much for having me. I can't believe we're in March, but we made it.
We did.
20 more days to spring.
That's right. I think everybody's got the countdown on. Although here in Ottawa, you wouldn't know it's 20 days to spring because it's snowing and it's cold. Well, I think if you're ready, we're just going to jump into our questions. Yep. We have quite a few. Great. So I think we'll start. So when I was preparing for our discussion, I obviously, looked into this topic a little bit more, and there's a lot of research about the link between trauma and eating disorders. So children that experience trauma are more prone to have food issues and eating disorders. Is this something that you agree with? And maybe you could elaborate more about why.
Absolutely. So one thing I wanted to start off with is that Chantal and I, as we started this, if there's any questions that people have as I'm talking, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And we do have a list of prepared questions, but I just wanted to kind of honor that if people have questions as we're going, please feel free to jump in. I want this to be as interactive as possible within the time that we have. So the first question sort of looking at, do children who've experienced trauma, are they more prone to food issues or eating disorders? So I didn't necessarily bring an exact number, but research does show, so from clinical experience and research does show that there is a strong connection and correlation between the experience of trauma and eating disorders or disordered eating. So what happens is that when a child or adult or anybody of any age experiences trauma, there is often emotional shutdown that happens, or it could be the desire to avoid the trauma memories. And one of the ways that people do that is by disconnecting with their bodies. There's many trauma responses, but people will avoid people, places, and things that remind them of the trauma or the traumatic experience. They'll do whatever, the child or adult kid will do whatever they can to block out the trauma. And one of the ways, it's not the only way that a child can cope or an individual can cope, is by developing disordered eating behaviors or an eating disorder. So, children who've experienced trauma are at a higher likelihood of developing an eating disorder. That said, there are many other ways that children cope with trauma. So it's not necessarily going to be manifested as an eating disorder. It's just one way that shows up. But I would say that it's a very common correlation. And I think having that trauma-informed approach of, what is my child presenting with, and what are the behaviors, and how do we decode that behavior, and then looking at, how do I take some steps back to really understand where this comes from.
Yes, well said, for sure. Thank you. Another question we had already was what is food insecurity when it relates to children, and how would that manifest as or behavior? I mean, I know there's not like a box that everybody fits in quite neatly, so there's a range, but
well, I think I myself, after you sent me these questions, I myself did a little bit more research on food insecurity, just to understand the term itself. So I've been familiar with the term, but I think the reality is that during COVID, this has become a whole different reality for individuals who, the reality of food insecurity. So food insecurity refers to inadequate or insecure access to food due often to lack of money or resources. So it is, food insecurity is actually, it's a public health issue. It's a serious public health issue. And, I think COVID has impacted on that for people. It's made things harder. But I think for children who are in the foster care system, or who have been, adopted either internationally or domestically, there is that understanding of, did they experience possible attachment issues or neglect or abandonment that can be manifested or show up as disordered eating behaviors. So it's, there's really, there's a spectrum between what we would classify as healthy eating to disordered eating. So it can be a whole range. So it's, it really is a spectrum of looking at the behaviors. But in terms of food insecurity, I think that it's definitely an expression of attachment issues and really wanting to reach out for control and security. So food is something that we have, it's a means of expression, right? It's something that we can't survive without, right? You can't make it through the day without water and food. So I think for a child, especially, child that's young, even for us as adults, that food becomes a means of expression. It becomes a metaphor. It becomes a way of expressing ourselves. And, I come again back to that decoding what is it for that kid, but it's, it's looking at that and honoring that there's a story behind this, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just a simple behavior. It's not something that the child is doing wrong. We're wanting to look at understanding where is it coming from? What does this mean? How can I support my kid with that?
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Thank you. So what are the possible food issues that children or teens can, or adults, I guess, could exhibit?
So again, I wanted to just, mention that there is sort of the spectrum of disordered eating shifting into eating disorders. Okay. So, I'll just go over it briefly. And then again, if people have specific questions that they want to put in the chat, they can. So it's just acknowledging that eating disorders are, they are serious mental health conditions or realities that people experience, and that impacts on their eating, and it also affects them physically, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, all aspects. So we look at it from a holistic perspective. We're really looking at a biopsychosocial model. So really looking at what are the different factors that have contributed to the onset of the eating disorder. So there is a strong genetic component. There's the whole nature versus nurture discussion of, did this come because it's in my genetic history? Is this something that happens from the nurture that I've had? And the reality is that it's for every individual. It can be a mixture of both. Everybody's narrative is different and everybody's story is different. But there are the main types of eating disorders, which are sort of the formal diagnostic terms. So, anorexia nervosa being one of them, is, really noticing that the child or adult is restricting their intake, is engaging in behaviors that are limiting their nutritional intake, really focused on potentially, weight loss, different behaviors that sort of indicate that they really are also struggling with mood. So the individual may present as irritable. There may be presentation of social isolation from friends and family. According to like statistics vary, obviously, but anorexia nervosa affects approximately 1% of young women. But I also want to just be clear, it is common in boys, younger children, in kids who identify as non-binary. It's across the spectrum. There is no one picture of a child or person that has an eating disorder. It can affect anybody from any cultural background, from any socioeconomic background. It's something that is across the board. There's also the diagnosis of bulimia nervosa, which is more rooted in the cycle of binge eating and purging. So what happens is that the individual does engage in, it could start that they're either restricting their intake or they engage in overeating, often due to that desire for control. But then they choose to sort of, the next step is they choose to engage in a compensatory behavior to get rid of the food that they've eaten. So that is either through what we would refer to as purging, so a form of vomiting, exercising. They might skip meals. They might use other, options like laxatives or diuretic pills, diet pills. So there's a very varied list of behaviors, but often it's really looking at the fact that it's starting with often binge eating, and then there is some type of compensatory behavior. So the difference obviously between anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa is anorexia nervosa is really looking at that severe restriction versus bulimia nervosa is looking at that sense of eating, right? That need for food, and then the shame and the guilt or the worry once that's happened, and then the thought of how am I going to get rid of that, and that shift. There is also binge eating disorder, which looks at often can present as overeating, binge eating. Sometimes a child will present with obesity. It's really it's very similar in that the child is binging, but they don't necessarily engage in any compensatory behaviors afterwards. So they're not necessarily engaging in any purging. They don't vomit or skip meals. They will continue to eat. It's just that their portions will be what would be considered a binge, and they would, that would be an emotional way of coping. So those are some of the three that I'll start with, but there are other diagnoses as well, but I just thought start with those.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think that's very helpful. So we've had more than a few questions from the community. So I'm kind of going to ball them up into one that sort of, they all center around whether their child could be hoarding food. So just stockpiling food and hiding it in their rooms, sneaking food. So having to sneak around, or even lying about what they ate. So I guess I know this is hard to just wrap it all up into one question. So I'm not really going that way. Just maybe if you could share suggestions to parents that have that situation going on for them at home.
Absolutely. So that was one of our questions, and I kind of want to really look at sort of, what is food hoarding? What does that look like? And also, what can we do about it, right? It says parents, it's a behavior. And what we want to start, again, what we kind of want to come back to is that it is not a positive or negative behavior. It is a behavior. The fact is that it's a behavior. And we want to really be cautious that we're not attaching judgment to that behavior, because food hoarding is a means of expression. So food hoarding is a coping strategy whereby a child may, as Chantal, as you kind of hit the nail on the head, may hoard, store, or steal food. Often it may be taking food to their room, hiding food in a safe space that they only know about, not being open about things that they've taken from the kitchen or the fridge, not being open to disclosing where the food went, so not necessarily taking ownership of that reality. So, the question is what can we really do to support the child as they're dealing with this, and how do as parents we work with this? So the first thing that comes to mind is that we don't want to ever block a child's access to food. So don't want to ever kind of stand in the way of a child having access to food. And what we mean by that, it doesn't mean that we're not necessarily going to be supporting our child in healthy portioning or in, making healthy choices, but we want there to be an open and safe space where our child can make food choices. So, we want to make food accessible. So we want to often promote it in the environments that often food is associated with. So really trying to keep foods to the kitchen, to really having, mealtime together as a family. Often kids who have experienced trauma or have lived through foster care or adoption, they may have a hard time self-regulating and sitting down at a table. So there may be reevaluating our expectations of how long a meal is going to last. So maybe, really looking at, well, maybe we're just going to have a short meal, but we're going to aim for everybody kind of sitting down at the table. So one of the, things we can do that's recommended is when a child is engaging in hoarding or experiencing that, is one tool is really making a safe space where the child has some choice around snacks. So often it's recommended is it either could be a cupboard in the kitchen, it could be another space where the child has access to either a basket or a box of different food items, often a mixture of, foods from different food groups, obviously that can be in that box, but allowing the child to sort of make their own choices and supporting them with that and allowing them to see that there is an abundance of food and that they have access to it at that time. So we really want to kind of really approach it with compassion and sensitivity, and really look at what is my child saying by engaging in this behavior. They're saying something and they may not be aware of what they're trying to communicate, but the eating disorder is a way to escape from trauma, and it's a way to disconnect from oneself, and it's a means of also emotional regulation. So when a child does engage in hoarding, it can be a form of self-soothing. So it can be a sense of ability to manage intense emotions. And it's just that reminder that food is so much more than just the nutrition that we have. It's tied to our senses, our memories, and our emotions. So often when a child is hoarding food, we want to look at, what do we know about their past? What do we know about their lived experience? What do we know about their trauma? I'll stop there. I feel like that was a long-winded answer, but
so good though. And I love that you said food, it's not, food just represents so much more than just the caloric intake, and how it is attached to our memories, culture, so many different things. And I like how you said, just creating that safe space so that the child, has access and never has to worry about that being part of the decision. But yeah, lots there for sure. So we'll take a break on that one because we have. So what about a child that only wants to eat processed food or junk food and flat out just refuses? So you, as a parent, you're like, okay, but let's have this first, and we'll just abstain from eating if there's not junk food. Any suggestions there?
So I think that's a struggle, right? So one of the things I want to also, validate and support is that, when Chantal, when you sent me these questions, it's like a lot of these, this is hard. This is a hard aspect of parenting, and it is really hard to know how to respond. And I think I come back to the analogy that I'm sure we all hear very often as foster parents, permanent parents, adoptive parents, is we need to put our oxygen masks on first before we're able to provide the care that we need for our kids. And it's really hard to take that step back and do that. So for a child who's wanting those food items, the first thing that I sort of hear in that question is we really want to take away any assessment of food as good or bad, as junk food or not. We want to really teach our kids, the idea of that all foods are okay, all foods are welcome in moderation. So we want to explore what does that look like in moderation. Granted, there are going to be kids who are going to refuse certain foods, and that can become a health issue. And I think in those cases, often there is a need to explore that with your child's pediatrician, explore that potentially with a dietitian to really look at, okay, how are we going to address this for my specific kiddo? Like, how are we going to do that? And what can we address? So definitely, if it is something that the child is amenable to some change, it would be introducing other food choices, balancing, the foods that they want with introducing new foods. I mean, definitely trying to make food prep exciting and novel. So including your child in everything from grocery shopping to meal planning and meal preparation, making it as fun as possible. It's not always possible, it's hard, but we want to kind of involve them as much as possible. And, really just including them in the discussions around, healthy eating, healthy food, and, how do we do that as a family?
That's great. And thank you for saying that, because it is hard. And I also want to say that was important too. Like, by just saying the words junk food, you're already labeling this as bad, and want to really take out that good versus bad and just, yeah. Okay, so another question about sensory issues. So what are some ways that, or what ways to help parents and caregivers recognize texture and sensory issues, and how that contributes to a child being picky?
Okay, so just gonna pull out a resource around that.
And I'm just going to jump in here, just in case people are jumping in now or later into the live stream, that you can ask questions. If you feel comfortable asking your question live, feel free to put it in the chat, and we can ask Hadassah. If you're watching this on replay, you can still put your question in the chat, and we will get back to you with an answer.
So what shows up for me when you asked that question was the reality that there is an eating disorder, which is known as avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. Okay. And individuals who are living with avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, so often what they present with is they're not interested in certain foods, or they may entirely avoid specific foods. They do present with potential weight loss, but they are not, and they don't necessarily gain the amount of weight that they're expected to, but they are not afraid. The difference between ARFID, which is the avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, and anorexia nervosa, is that the individual is generally not afraid of gaining weight, and they also don't struggle with body image distress. So it's more about the actual foods. So people with ARFID don't eat because they are turned off by either the smell, taste, texture, or color of the food. They may be afraid. So some individuals who've had trauma experiences with something like difficulties with swallowing, or if they've ever had an experience of choking on a food, that early childhood trauma can actually stay with the person and impact on them later. So they don't have necessarily anorexia or bulimia or another medical problem that would explain their eating behaviors. So we're really looking at what is that constellation of symptoms that they're presenting with, and what is the foods that they're avoiding, and what are the reasons that they're avoiding those foods. And sometimes it takes a while. It takes a lot of detective work to understand why is that child avoiding certain foods, but the response often therapeutically for children with ARFID is that it is often recommended that, you know, a dietitian be involved, a doctor fully be involved, but that you start with the foods that the child is willing to eat and really promoting the caloric intake. So really trying to encourage your child to have whatever they're open to having, and then slowly introducing other foods that would be considered risk or challenge foods, and doing that with the support of hopefully a therapist or you know, a dietitian.
Okay, thank you. And so in situations, is it possible for a child or a teenager that has food issues, just to, I mean, I know that's a very sort of broad way to describe it. Do they just, can they resolve eventually over time?
So that's one thing that when I saw that question, I was like, okay, that one I can answer. Is I think it's so important to acknowledge and put out there that there's always hope. There's always opportunity for change. So I've seen people make changes in their life as kids, as young adults. I've also seen people make changes in their lives later on in life. Really depends on everybody's story and narrative. But I think that as a parent, it's always so important, especially if you're struggling with a child with an eating disorder, to have that space of hope and to know that it's okay to ask for help and that you are not alone, and to reach out for as much support as you can.
Yeah, I think that's very important. Thank you for saying that. So on that same note, the parents and caregivers that are parenting children that have an eating disorder or any food issue, you know, they experience a variety of emotions. And I think, you know, you touched on that earlier, whether it's they're worried, they feel guilty, or, you know, what advice, I know we just touched on, like, just to go easy and not to be so hard on themselves. Any other advice that you want to share for a parent that is struggling with their mental health or feeling overwhelmed and burnt out?
So for sure, going back to that analogy of putting on your oxygen mask first, but talk to someone, talk to your family doctor, talk to a support person, get as much information as you can. So just go through some strategies of what, you know, a parent or caregiver can do. You know, and these are just some ideas. It's not comprehensive, but, you know, one is starting to educate yourself about eating disorders and the resources that are available out there. And I did share with Chantal a number of books that are related to kids and teens with eating disorders, as well a page of a list of resources that was put out by the Canadian Mental Health Association. Again, these resources are a starting point. They'll be shared in the chat at the end of the talk, but, you know, they're only a starting point. But I often find we want to start through knowledge, right? Not through educating ourselves and getting as much information as we can. You know, we also want to find a space to talk about these issues in a calm atmosphere. So if this is happening in our families, we want to sort of not have these conversations during meals or in a crowded room. We want to find a place where we can have the difficult conversations. Some people, parents will say they find it helpful to have difficult conversations in the car. Sometimes when you're in motion, there's a different rhythmic reality to that, but in a way that feels supported, where you could actually bring this forward and be able to talk about it. It's also really essential to remember that kids and adults, or anybody of any age that has an eating disorder, they have not chosen to have an eating disorder. They did not make that choice. It is not a choice. It is something that they are living with. That is a serious mental health reality that they're struggling with. We want to also really focus on feelings, emotions, and behaviors rather than on food and appearance. So we want to really look at, observations that are leading to your concern about your child's behavior, but we don't want that to be associated with food or appearance or weight and shape. Yes, that's important, but we want to kind of bring it back more so to, I'm worried about how you're doing emotionally. I'm worried about these behaviors that I'm seeing. really sort of separating that from actual food behaviors and appearance. Want to really use I statements to help show that you are sharing your perspective and that it's coming from you, and you're communicating in a way that is not about blaming, it's more reflection. So for example, I've noticed, or I feel you are, right? And sharing that. And then asking the child, I think for any child, asking them, how can I help? Right? Even starting with that space, what can I do to help? Listening carefully and empathetically to what they have to say, and reminding them that they, you're working with them because you want them to be healthy, And I'll end with just, communicating as often as possible your love, acceptance, your appreciation for who they are, and your commitment to standing by them for as long as it takes, and that recognizing that making changes are extremely difficult, but that you are there for them no matter what. Again, a long answer, sorry.
Well, and I think that's a great list of suggestions. And like you said, it's not, there's probably other input that other parents might have. So, if you're watching this now or later, and you have something to add to that list, feel free, because I know that there's a lot of parents and caregivers in the community that experience this. So any helpful comments would be appreciated too. So I'm just going to say, Hadassah mentioned that there was a list, and I have that list, and I will share that list with you all. I'm going to put it in the chat later once we're off the live. So there are some book recommendations and a lot of great links also. So you can start with that and like grow from there, and talk to your peers and have those conversations like Hadassah mentioned. And the thing about the car, I've heard that too, and I do it too. And I think it's part of it is because you're not forced in this face-to-face eye contact situation where you can kind of check on them in the rearview mirror a little bit, but they feel a little bit more open to expressing themselves, they don't feel on the spot.
And I think the reality is, as you're sharing, is there's so many tools and strategies, and in the moment, it can be really, really hard to think, okay, what do I do in this moment? So talking about it, sharing ideas online, continuing the dialogue. I think that we continue to just share tools and strategies, and then try different things. And it's often an experiment, right? Like parenting is really that experimentation. I'm going to try this out, see if it works for my kid. Maybe it doesn't. And then I go back to the drawing board and I try something, else. But knowing that we want to practice brutal honesty about what our child is experiencing, what we're experiencing. There can be shame and stigma associated with my child is struggling with this. Did I do something? Is it my fault? How did this happen? The more that we realize that this is not something that anybody, it's an illness. It is a serious illness, and everybody deserves support and care to be able to deal with this illness that can be very serious, very hard to know how to address. And, we all need support around it.
Yeah, and I think that's important. And you said it earlier too, that it's not a choice, right? It is an illness. And I think that's a great place to start from when you're starting to have those conversations. Because it could come up too, like if you're at a family, and how do you, you might have a relative say, well, why is your child not doing this? Or, and so, obviously there's a place and time for these conversations, and sometimes it's better just to not get into things. But I think in your own self, that's where you can start. And I don't feel like you have to, make excuses or come up with some reasoning to explain what your child eats or doesn't eat. Or
Absolutely.
So we just have a couple minutes left. So I thought maybe if there's any other message that you wanted to share with the community that we didn't cover in our questions, or something that you want to amplify.
So I'm just looking at what's in front of me. I brought a bunch of resources with me, and I guess I'll just end with what we can do in the here and now, what we can do today to look at eating disorder prevention and supporting just each other in the community to deal with these issues. So I'm just going to go over through a number of steps. Some of them may have already been mentioned, but just taking steps to learn more about eating disorders, being here in this space, starting the dialogue, being a positive role model, and choosing to live a healthy, well-rounded lifestyle. It's not easy, but also you recognizing that as a parent, your child is constantly observing how you interact with your family, with the world, and that they are absorbing everything and really looking at, how can we be positive role models? Recognizing that health and well-being comes in all shapes and sizes, really starting to notice and question, society's messages around beauty and ideal body types, really supporting your kids and talking about that, being able to develop social media literacy, supporting your kid and being able to know how to, refuse to accept media images that are unhealthy, talking to people about eating disorders, really looking at, I think we mentioned this earlier, but avoiding labeling foods as good or bad. Really, food is just food, and we want to kind of stick with that. And really, supporting each other in maintaining compassion and fostering the self-worth with our kids, really building their self-esteem and their self-worth. And I'll end with that.
I'm going to admit that I've never heard the term eating disorder prevention. Yeah. I know it's not like our scripted, it wasn't on our list, but I'd like to know, so is that something as parents you would start when your children are really young? What is?
So that is something that can be done with kids individually. It could also be done in schools. It is often done in schools where we look at it from a health promotion model, where we're coming in to teach young kids about the messages that we get from society around food, eating, dieting, and looking at that society has the nurture reality of what we're living through contributes to the biopsychosocial realities of eating disorder, and really looking at how do I support my child in being informed and educated. So they, health promotion around eating disorders starts as young, grade 1, grade 2, just starting to talk about, healthy eating, not focus, honoring diverse body shapes and sizes. There's a whole area of work on health promotion and prevention.
I learned so much today. Thank you so much, Hadassah.
My pleasure.
I'll just say again, if you're watching this on replay and you do have a question about eating disorder or a food issue that your child may be experiencing, feel free to put it in the chat and we will make sure that you get some information. So before we go, I'll just mention that next week, my guest is going to be Melissa Guida Richards. She is an adult adoptee and she wrote a book recently called What White Parents Should Know About Transracial Adoption, an adoptee's perspective on its history, nuances, and practices. So I'm really looking forward to that. So I hope you'll be able to join me next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. And thank you again, Hadassah, for sharing your time and your knowledge and your experience with us. It is very appreciated. And we'll see you all next week. So have a great rest of your week. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.